Titans, today is your day to get a summary of the Edge of Fate changes and some builds to try out in Edge of Fate. I will be taking all these builds and comparing them between now and how they will fare in Edge of Fate with the new stat rework, along with full stat layouts with archetypes and all that stuff, so you can see how things are going to work and get some ideas to build with. On top of that, I will be going through all the changes that are upcoming in Edge of Fate, including melee changes, exotic armor changes, and any other miscellaneous changes for Titan, so that you can be prepared to build as we approach the expansion very quickly. If all that sounds good to you, let's get into it. I'm Engineer. As I mentioned, I'm going over all the changes upcoming. I will be going through 6 Titan builds. 3 of them are solar. We're going to be doing a Bonk Titan with Wormgod Caress. We're going to do Ashen Wake, the fusion grenade thrower. Phoenix Cradle, which is a buffed support exotic. And then we're going to do Arc Storm Crash, just because it is still one of the best options for DPS, and I think it'll remain so in Edge of Fate. And then we're going to go over to Strand, Wishful Ignorance, Fletched Storm, which I think is going to be super juiced. And lastly, I want a Stasis build, so I went with Cadmus Lancecap, because I think it'll be pretty good with the upcoming artifact meta. A few disclaimers before we get into this. This is pre-release and things may change. We do have the abilities tuning article. We are expecting a weapons tuning article this week. Another disclaimer, I only cover PvE. A lot of these changes are very PvE focused though, but if there's anything about PvP you care about, I'm not your guy. Find a different content creator for that. The stat benefit assumptions are based on the current best estimate math. I will be updating all the tools and build planners as we learn more, but do take all this with a little bit of a grain of salt. All that said, I've done a lot of work into substantiating it, and I think it'll be good. If you're not familiar with my videos, there will be timestamps of every single part of this. I'm doing this in Google Slides, and those slides will also be linked in the description, and I will also link to any of the calculations that I use for this. All that said, let's get into it. So first, melee changes. If you watched my melee breakdown video, you may have seen a lot of this already, so I will go through it pretty quickly, but I think it is very relevant to the Titan class because of how many builds are kind of melee focused. Melee buff stacking is going to be additive, not multiplicative. That is very math heavy. I recommend you watch my melee breakdown video if you really want to understand that. Generally, what that means is when you stack a lot of buffs, you're gonna get a nerf from this. But when you're stacking 1 or 2 buffs, you're gonna get a buff. And the reason for that is because they have removed any decreased effects when stacking, and they have buffed pretty much every melee buff in the game to compensate for this somewhat. 1, Roaring Flames, the melee buff is increased from 73% boosted damage to 200%, but this does not apply to glaives. Knockout on the Arc subclass will make all melee buffs go up to 160%, up from 100% for uncharged melees and 50% from charged melees, and these will work with glaives at full effect, so take advantage of that. Offensive Bulwark on Void, the buff is going from 100% to 160% and will also work with glaives. Banner of War's melee buff for you and allies is being increased from 40% to 100%, but this does not apply to Blade Fury. And then lastly, Consecration is going to 2 fragment slots on Prismatic, but 3 fragment slots on Solar. So a little nerf on Prismatic and a little buff on Solar. Moving over to our exotic armors that are related to melee. So once again, no more decreased effects when stacking. Heart of Endless Light's melee buff is going from 20% to 50%, and it will also apply to glaives and unpowered melees, which sounds a little weird. Peregrine Greaves shoulder charge melee boost against weaker enemies, that's not bosses, champions, or mini bosses, go from 363% to 4th. Now, the buff to champions, bosses, and mini bosses stays at 1000%, which is crazy. That will remain quite strong. Syntheseps and Spirit of Syntheseps, the melee buff is unchanged, but it did have a lot of decreased effects when stacking, and those are all gone. Wishful Ignorance, the melee buff to Frenzied Blade and Fletched Storm is being increased to 200% from 100% for Frenzied Blade and 50% for Fletched Storm. So Fletched Storm's melee buff is increasing 4 times, which is crazy. And then lastly, Wormgod Caress, the melee buff is going from 275% to 400%, which is just massive. Now that one is a little bit harder to upkeep and does require constant kills, but ooh, it's strong. Another major change that mostly will affect Solar is that Scorch and Ignition will no longer be buffed by melee buffs. Scorch and Ignition are going to be fixed verbs like Jolt that do not scale. Now, this is mostly going to hit Consecration. Consecration damage is composed of a few parts. There's an initial wave that applies to Scorch and does baby damage, then the slam wave that does some respectable damage, and it will ignite the Scorched enemies, and then the ignition that results from that. And that ignition is currently 63% of the base damage, but they have also taken out an intrinsic buff to ignitions of 20%. 8%. So it used to be 900 damage and now it's down to 750. So that's one thing nerfing it. And now that ignition takes no buffs whatsoever. So you can actually see a damage comparison here of before and after. Your buffs are actually going up considerably. On solar, you're going from about 400% to 800%. And on prismatic, you go from about 400% to 600%. But you are actually taking a huge damage nerf because ignition is such a big part of the damage. Now, what does this mean? Consecration's still going to be good. It's just not going to be nuking mini bosses and bosses. It's mostly going to be for ad clear. I will say I do like that solar now has a potential to hit even harder than prismatic, but prismatic will still remain very spammable thanks to transcendence. So I think this will still be strong. You're just going to have to kind of build into it a little bit more and probably hit a few more times. Let's move over to our exotic reworks. So first we have Crest of Alpha Lupi and Spirit of Alpha Lupi. So currently this provides heal on class ability usage. That's 80 HP for Barricade and 60 HP for Thruster. But now they're adding the effect of sustained damage behind a barricade triggers a smaller healing pulse. So we expect it to be less than 80 HP. And just for reference, you have 200 HP at full resilience. So it's probably pretty small. Hopefully can trigger this pretty frequently. Now, another thing they're being given though is healing allies will give barricade energy, and this is also going on Spirit of Alpha Lupi. So that may help in some cases, but there's not very great access to healing on prismatic for teammates, so not really sure if that'll see a lot of use. Now, our other support-oriented exotic rework is Phoenix Cradle. This is an exotic that allows allies to benefit from your sunspots and makes Sol Invictus last longer from sunspots. So they're going to make sunspots look more supportive, which will be weird because there's a little fire on the ground and they're going to make it look supportive. So it'll be a nice happy flame, I guess. Beyond that, dealing sustained solar weapon damage in a sunspot will extend it, and providing solar buffs to allies has a chance to create sunspots. So I think this is potentially really good. Now, a lot of times when Bungie says has a chance to, they actually mean you need to do this so many times and then you will automatically get it. That's how pretty much every chance works. So I would expect about every 1 to 3 times you buff allies, you're going to make a sunspot. But we'll see. This is another one we'll have to kind of check out, but I think this is going to be very viable and very strong. And with all the emphasis on solar and the artifact, I think this one could be very cool. Our 2 weapons focused exotic reworks are Path of the Burning Steps and Actium War Rig. So Path of the Burning Steps, this used to give a damage boost that stacked with weapon surges and radiant and all that, and it was very strong. And then they turned it to weapon surges, and now they're changing it back. Now this is being tied to Roaring Flames, so as you get stacks of that, which stacks up to 3 times, you'll get plus 10, plus 15, or plus 20% solar weapon damage boost, and a boost to ignition of 5, 10, or 15%, which is kind of cool because they were like, hey, ignitions are standard, and then they're like, ah, here's a boost. But hey, I'll take it. Ignitions are very fun, and maybe this is what you need to make those consecration builds work well again. I think this is gonna be ideal with gun and ability builds because you can only build Roaring Flame stacks with ability kills or ignition kills. So unless you have weapons that can consistently cause ignitions, you're gonna kind of have to flip between these. But this does seem to have good synergy, and I think it'll be kind of fun. So this is a good one, but just want to see kind of how it works a little bit more. Now our other exotic is Actium War Rig. Right now this auto loads auto rifles and machine guns at all times, and they are giving this a buff where auto rifle or machine gun final blows increase their stability, ammo generation, and damage, and this stacks up to 10 times. And this has higher tiers expiring faster like Wormgod Caress or Verity. So they basically call it Wormgun Caress, which I think is kind of a cool idea. Once again though, they didn't tell us what the damage buff is for this, so this is kind of a wait and see. This could be a dinky like 10%, or it could be something pretty strong like Peacekeepers, so we'll have to see with that. But I think this will be very fun and potentially helpful. And an important thing to note here is that this is only on final blows, so this will purely be an ad clear exotic, which I think is still very good in activities like GMs or seasonal activities, but you probably won't see it much in raids or dungeons. Now our last 2 exotic reworks are Abeyant Leap and Mark 44 Stand-asides. Abeyant Leap is just getting an increased iteration of Suspend. You'll see a little bit later they're also buffing Drinker's Lash, but they're really just trying to make this all a little bit more reliable, and I think that's cool. I honestly think this exotic is great as is, so I don't think this needed it, but I will gladly take any buffs to it because it's a really fun build. Mark 44 Stand-asides, currently this grants an overshield when sprinting with shoulder charge abilities, but it kind of fits weird with Juggernaut on Arc, and hits restore some melee energy, so they're changing this up. So now if you have Juggernaut active, which gives you an overshield as you are trying to do your Arc shoulder charge, it will give you bolt charge when sprinting, and it will also give allies behind you speed speed booster, which is kind of cool, but I think not very useful. Maybe it is more of a PvP thing, and that's why it doesn't make sense to me. Now, it is important that Bolt Charge will give you melee energy, so as you're sprinting with Juggernaut active, you're just going to constantly be boosting up some melee energy, and that's kind of cool. But this is now strictly an Arc exotic. You can't use it on any other class. You can't get Juggernaut on anything but Arc, so I don't think anyone was really using it on Solar or Void, but not really sure where they're going for with this rework, but I don't think the usage of this is going to go up very much at all. Other small Titan changes. First, Storm's Keep barricades don't stack anymore. Your barricades don't stack, your teammates' barricades don't stack. Honestly, I'm not surprised by this. This was going to happen eventually, and it's going to make it standard. I think a Storm's Keep barricade will totally be a staple in many damage phases, but you won't see like 6 of them. You're just going to see, all right, we need one guy on it, we need one on the well, and that's kind of how it goes. As I mentioned just a minute ago, Drenger's Lash has increased range and duration, so it's just getting even better. And then lastly, Shield Throw is getting its projectile tracking increased by 77%, which sounds like a lot. Once again, though, we have to kind of test it out to see what that actually feels like, because sometimes the tracking on this is pretty rough, but hopefully it's good because it's really fun melee, but it just does not see much use because of that. Right before we get into the builds, I want to highlight the featured exotics for Titans next season. I will not be reading these, but these are the ones who are considered new or featured, and because of that, when you equip them, you'll get 3% damage resistance for that slot. Now, if you have all 5 slots as featured armor, which most of us will because we have to refarm most of our armor to fit into the new system, you get a total of 15% damage resistance at tier 5. It's unclear how it scales from tier 1 to tier 5 on your armor, but it is important to note that the exotic only accounts for 3% damage resistance, and this featured armor benefit does not apply in contest mode or PvP. So this is a slight advantage to these, but I really don't think it's big, and I think most of us will forget about it in a few months, not really worry about it much again. I will be featuring a few of these in the current builds, which is mostly just a happy coincidence, but yeah, let's get into those. First up, I am resurrecting a kind of ancient Solar Titan build that I have not used in a long time because they made a change a few seasons back that when you use a throwing hammer, when you pick it up, it does not instantly recharge. It takes about 1.3 seconds, but according to Bungie, with the new melee stat, if you build into it heavily, you get the instant recharge back at higher than 70 melee stats. So I think it's a great time to bring that back, especially with the melee changes. And with that, we're going to take Wormgod Caress because it is the biggest damage buff you can get, and it will also boost your weapons. Now, if you do want to use Synthoceps instead, that is also very good. It just requires being surrounded, and it will also boost your super damage if you're surrounded, so that can be very effective. Now for aspects, we're going to use Roaring Flames because that is our other big damage boost, and Soul Invictus because that makes sunspots when we get the solar ability kills, and those will give us restoration and increased ability regen. For grenades, I like Thermite Grenade because we're going to have plenty of healing already, but it is flexible. For the melee, I absolutely recommend Throwing Hammer, and then for the class ability, Rally Barricade's fine, it doesn't matter a whole lot. On the fragments, we take Ember of Solace to make our buffs last longer, Ember of Empyrean to extend those buffs, Ember of Torches to get Radiant every time we beam somebody with the Throwing Hammer, and then Ember of Searing let us generate Fire Sprites whenever we kill Scorched enemies. As for the mods, focus on Orb Generation, Solar Weapon Damage, and Melee Fonts for more damage because of the stats. The gameplay for this is hilarious and a little simple, but all you're going to do is run up to an enemy, get point blank, and you're just going to constantly beat them with the hammer until they die. And in between that, maybe mix in a 1-2 punch shotgun or one of the 1-2 punch hand cannon spread shot shotguns that we should be getting in Edge of Fate, because those would be a good way to constantly get that buff up and just do some really good damage. But that is really all it is. It's kind of a fun and simple build, and it will keep you pretty alive too, because every time you pick up the hammer, you also get a little bit of a heal. It's a good loot. As for the stats, we are going to go focusing fully on melee. We are going to get that almost up to 200 because of a Font of Melee mod, which will give us a 128% melee damage boost. I mentioned earlier that they are changing melee buff stacking to be additive, not multiplicative. There is one exception to this, and it is the up to 30% buff from the melee stat. So that will be multiplicative on top of everything else. So you absolutely want to juice that as high as possible. On top of this, we are getting higher grenade and melee uptime. You can see all the different buffs, mods, and different benefits we're getting, and which ones are better or worse between current and after Edge of Fate. As I mentioned before, one of the biggest benefits here is the instant hammer regen, and you can also see the stats I'm using currently. We don't really have to put much into melee at all. I do end up putting some points into it just because I have leftover stats, but that's really it. And lastly, I have achieved the stat spread on the right with 3 Paragon archetypes and 2 Brawler archetypes. So not super complicated. You just want to focus on melee. And then we're also going to take some benefit to our super. As I mentioned, very simple build, but I think it'll be very effective in a lot of content. Moving on to our next solar build, it is Phoenix Cradle. Now, as we talked about before, it lets allies use your sunspots, and then providing solar buffs to teammates has a chance to create sunspots. So I'm going to really recommend you pair this with a heal clip weapon, because every time you reload after a kill, you're going to heal all your nearby, and you're probably going to make some sunspots. Our aspects are once again Roaring Flames and Soul Invictus to get a damage boost on our abilities and to generate sunspots, because we need that to make the whole exotic work. For our fragments, we want Emperor of Benevolence, so that every time we buff our allies, we get plus 400% base grenade, melee, and class ability regen speed for 6 seconds. We're going to take Ember of Empyrean to extend our buffs, Ember of Torches to give that radiant out, because that'll be another way to make sunspots, and then Ember of Searing to generate fire spreads to keep our grenade looping. Now, I generally recommend the healing grenade for this, just to have another way to buff teammates, but it is flexible. Throwing Hammer is once again going to be the strongest for this, because it will let you apply radiant more often with Ember of Torches. And then once again, the Barricade's pretty flexible, but Rally Barricade's nice for your team. On the mod side, just focus on orb generation, solar weapon surges, and ability fonts, because we really want to keep all those abilities going. And then the gameplay is really simple. Just try and buff allies as much as possible, make sunspots, just keep slaying out so that you can keep healing allies, giving them radiant and all that stuff. And it should make everybody's life a lot easier. Just free restoration, even though it's not the biggest healing, is really effective and will help everybody survive. Looking at the stat comparisons, we are going for a pretty even approach here with just a little bit of extra into weapons, because we've satisfied our melee, our grenade, and our super, just trying to get those to 100. Now, because we are getting melee to just under 100, we will also get that instant throwing hammer, so you can also lean back on that if you need to, but just a lot of buffs here. The class regen is worse. You can see that Ember of Benevolence is scaled by the stats, so you can see the melee and grenade regen is super high, but the class regen is a little bit lower. But once again, I don't think we're going to lean on that too much. We are getting a solid 15% extra damage to minors and majors, which will help us with those heal clip weapons, and then we are also getting a higher chance of large ammo bricks, some extra special ammo damage to bosses, and extra heavy damage to bosses, but not a lot because we're not super invested into it. And I'm achieving this stat spread with 4 gunner archetypes and 1 paragon. We are mostly focused on weapons here, with just a little bit of focus on super and melee, but overall really solid. I think this is going to make this perform even better. You can see the stats I have now are once again pretty solid, pretty standard for solar, kind of seeing what you get a lot of times, but very effective. Moving on to our last solar build, this is Ashen Wake. Now, this is not a featured exotic this episode, which I think is sad, but gosh, this is a fun exotic. If you're not aware, this improves fusion grenades. They fly straighter, they explode on impact, and they're just generally really fun to use. It feels like you're throwing straight fireballs. And the other benefit of this exotic is it returns grenade energy on kills. You get 25% energy per miner, and for elite level enemies, you get 50% of a grenade charge, which is crazy. So once again, we're going to take Roaring Flames because it'll boost the damage of our fusion grenades, which is really cool. We're going to take Soul Invictus for the extra regen and the restoration that it provides us. On our fragment side, very similar setup. We're going to take Ember of Solace for longer buffs, Ember of Empyrean to extend those buffs, Ember of Torches to get some radiant in there as well, and then we're going to take Ember of Searing so we can create fire sprites to get the grenade energy off of them. Our grenade has to be fusion grenade to use the exotic. We're also going to use Throwing Hammer because we can kind of mix it in with the fusion grenade to just finish off enemies that don't quite die or soften them up for the fusion grenade. And then we're going to take, for our mods, grenade kickstarts and a font of grenade, and then we're going to just focus on orb generation. Gameplay is simple: throw fireballs. Just you see a clump of enemies, throw a fusion grenade into them and watch them explode. It's a lot of fun. It does tend to fall off as enemies get harder to kill though, so this won't be the best end game build, but you will definitely have some fun with this. Moving on our stats, we are getting 158.5% grenade damage, which is crazy, and it's going to make this scale a lot further than it used to. Grenade regen is juiced. Because this is hopefully scaling the Ashen Wake effect, we will get a refund on 3 minor kills or 2 kills with kickstart. And for elites, we will be able to get the grenade charge back fully with a kickstart or with just 1 elite and 1 minor. So you should be able to just cycle the fusion grenades constantly with this, and it's going to be very good. Now we are doing that by getting to 190 in the grenade stats. So that is purely our focus here, and then we're just trying to get melee to at least 70 so we don't take any penalties, and then just getting some super, which is pretty easy with how the archetypes are set up. I won't go through every single buff here, but you can see almost every single buff except for ones related to class cooldown are improved from the current condition, which is really cool. And we're just using 5 Grenadier archetypes. This is a pure grenade build, and that is all we need for this, but very effective. Grenade builds are going to be awesome with the new stat system, I think. The next build is one that was actually the last Titan build video I did, and it is Arc Queers to the Falling Star with Storm's Keep. I call that video Ultimate Storm Crash because you're focused on Thunder Crash and Storm's Keep. If you're not aware, Queers to the Falling Star gives super energy on any melee kills. These can be unpowered melee kills. They can be powered melee kills. Currently, they cannot be glaive melee kills, but I would be curious to check if they can be once Edge of Fate hits with all the melee changes coming. And then the other benefit is this gives you plus 55% Thunder Crash damage, which is huge. For our aspects, we're going to take Storm's Keep because it is very good for DPS, and Touch of Thunder because it makes our pulse grenade stronger and generate ionic traces, which generates bolt charge and gives us our barricade back, and it just keeps the whole loop going. Now for our fragments, I have a much more detailed breakdown on this in the full build video for it, but definitely recommend Spark of Resistance because it's 25% damage resistance when surrounded by enemies. And then we take Spark of Ions because that will generate ionic traces for us when we kill jolted enemies. And then we take Spark of Discharge because this will make it so every time we collect an ionic trace, we get bolt charge, which will be very effective with the Touch of Thunder pulse grenades. And then we take Spark of Frequency because that will make us get an extra second bolt charge anytime we gain bolt charge. So now ionic traces give you 2 bolt charge stacks, which is very effective to keeping that loop going on Storm's Keep and getting the bolt discharges off. Some other fragments to consider: if you were dropping one of the ones above, I would drop Spark of Ions because it's the most optional in this group, but Spark of Beacons will blind enemies when you get special or heavy ammo arc weapon kills while amplified. That's a lot, but it will generally provide a lot more crowd control as you're clearing stuff, and that is helpful. Spark of Magnitude will make your pulse grenades last longer, and Spark of Shock will apply Jolt on hit. That may be more valuable in Edge of Fate versus now, because right now we have an artifact perk that applies Jolt, but work with your team, see if you need a source of Jolt on the boss, and if you do, definitely take Spark of Shock. Our abilities are pretty straightforward. We take Thunder Crash for our exotic, we take Pulse Grenade because it is the best for DPS and generates ionic traces. Thunderclap is a very good AoE melee. Rally Barricade is absolutely the best option for Storm's Keep because it has a shorter cooldown and we can shoot over it and we get a reload speed boost. For our mods, we focus weapon surges and orb generation for that DPS. And then the gameplay is really simple. During DPS, you pop your barricade and you shoot from behind it with your team, and then you use Thunder Crash when it is convenient for damage. Looking at our stat, we are getting 130% super damage. You may see that and see that super at 168 out of 200 and be like, why aren't you getting 200? 1, I'm using tier 3 armor in all these comparisons, and 2, I don't want to lose out on melee, grenade, or class. I don't want to dump any of those stats because I need the regen high, and I need class as high as possible because the barricade is a huge source of damage for me and my team. So that is why we were taking some compromises there. I believe I'm using 1 font of super in here just to make that happen, but we want to get as much damage on that super as possible because Thunder Crash is a great damage super. Because of that, we are getting a shorter class cooldown, a shorter melee cooldown, a shorter grenade cooldown. And every bit of regen we are getting from mods or ionic traces or bolt charge is stronger than it is in the base game, and that's really cool. Overall, if you've been using this currently, it's going to behave better in Edge of Fate in every single way. You're going to have better regen. The only thing you're losing is the artifact perks, but we're going away anyways. Now to get to the stat spread, I'm using 3 Paragon archetypes, 1 Grenadier, and 1 Specialist archetype. Moving over to Strand. This is a build I'm so excited to talk about. I did a video on this episode. It was really fun, and they are boosting as I mentioned earlier, they are boosting the damage increase on Wishful Ignorance for Fletched Storm up to 200% from 50%. Now how this works is it works on consecutive hits. So what you want to do is you want to stack up multiple charges and then just unload as much as possible at once. It will take 3 hits to get to the max damage, but if you have a full set of Frenzied Blade charges, you can get off 5 of those blasts. So everything from the 3rd on will do the full damage. Now the other thing that Wishful Ignorance does in addition to boosting the damage is that every time Banner of War pulses, which gets up to 1 second at max stacks, you will get melee energy depending on how many allies are near you. And this does actually include yourself too, but this is very beneficial in team settings, and it gets even more beneficial as you get into like a raid with 5 teammates versus like a dungeon with 2 teammates. So for our aspects, we obviously want to take Banner of War and Fletched Storm so we can use both sides of this exotic. For our fragments, we take Thread of Generation just for grenade ability energy. Take Thread of Fury just to get a little bit more melee energy. We take Thread of Warding so that we have a source of Woven Mail whenever we pick up an orb. And we take Threat of Isolation because in a lot of cases, if you're fighting stronger enemies, we want to debuff them, and Sever is a 40% cut on their outgoing damage, which is really helpful just from scoring some precision hits. So carry an auto rifle and you can debuff pretty much any major enemy. On the abilities, I'm taking Grapple Grenade, but the grenade is pretty flexible. Just keep in mind that that is the shortest cooldown of the Strand grenades, and the other ones will be a little bit longer. For the melee, you only have Frenzy Blade. For the barricade, it doesn't really matter what you take whichever one works. For the mods, I recommend building up orbs and weapon support. Kickstarts don't really work with this because with multiple charges, the kickstarts only kick in as you completely run out of charges, and then it's reduced, not worth it. So we're just going to focus on weapon support instead of building into melee kickstarts. For the stat comparison, we are getting up to 184 melee. That will give us a multiplier of 125.2% on our melee damage, which is very cool. The best part though is the melee energy, which is normally 5% per pulse, is now going up to 7.1% per pulse. So we will be getting 21% melee energy per second when we have 2 allies, and when we have 5 allies, we'll get 42% melee energy per second, which is crazy. Basically every 2 seconds you're getting a full melee charge. So in about 6 seconds you can put out a full blast of Fledged Storm at 200% boost for half the blast. It's going to be really fun. We've still managed to keep grenade and super decently high. We're not really focused on class or weapons in this, but I think that's going to be pretty typical. We end up with a little bit in health, and it's just because of how focused we are in a melee, but some free healing on Strand is never a bad thing. For the archetypes, we did 3 Brawler and 2 Paragon archetypes. Once again, not super complicated here. We're just purely focused on melee, and those are the 2 archetypes that boost melee. For our last build, I wanted to do a Stasis build, and I actually went and tested out a few in some Legend campaign missions, and none of them really felt very good until I got to this one, and I looked back at the artifact, and a lot of it is built on weapon hits and kind of playing like that. So I thought about Cadmus Ridge Lancecap, and I think it's actually made pretty strong, especially with some of the new weapons coming. So if you're not aware, Cadmus Ridge Lancecap will, whenever you throw a Diamond Lance and hit an enemy, it will create a Stasis Crystal, which is always good for extra damage. And then multiple precision hits behind a barricade on enemies will create Diamond Lances. So you just plop down your barricade, start shooting, and lances will pop up periodically. You just throw them as soon as you can. For aspects, I recommend Tectonic Harvest because that is how we will get our Frost Armor. And then you can take Diamond Lance, but you actually don't need to, because this generates Diamond Lances with or without that aspect. You can take something like Howl the Storm or Cryoclasm. Howl the Storm, it makes your melee a lot stronger and kind of builds into that crystal generation a bit more. So that's usually what I end up on, but you can also take Diamond Lance and just get even more lances. For the fragments are very nailed down here, but you do get an extra fragment slot if you take Diamond Lance. That may be an argument for it, but you absolutely want to take Whisper of Rhyme because that takes your Frost Armor stacks up to 8 times instead of 5, and the duration from 9 seconds to 13 seconds. At 8 stacks, Frost Armor will give you 50% damage resistance, which is humongous. Whisper of Conduction will make Stasis Shards track to you as long as they're within 15 meters, which just makes your life a lot easier and makes those Stasis Shards a lot more useful. Whisper of Rending will make it easier to shatter crystals, which will be very effective just so you don't have to take time shooting at crystals when you want to be shooting at enemies. Whisper of Shards will increase your grenade regen by 500% of the base grenade regen speed whenever you destroy a Stasis Crystal, which we'll do pretty frequently. I generally recommend pairing this build with a Headstone weapon and maybe even a Rhyme Stealer weapon, because then you can just generate constant crystals and it's very helpful. If you do have that extra fragment slot from Diamond Lance, or if you don't feel like you need one of these other ones, Whisper of Refraction will give you class ability energy whenever you kill stasis debuffed enemies, which is going to be most of the enemies you fight. For abilities, I recommend Glacier Grenade just to make more crystals, and then you're kind of stuck with Shiver Strike and you have to take Rally Barricade for the exotic. For the mods, fully focused on weapon damage and support. As for the gameplay, as I mentioned, stand behind your barricade, shoot enemies, throw lances. Gonna be kind of more of a slow and steady, like gun from cover, really good in like higher end activities where enemies hit a bit harder and you have to play a bit more carefully, but really fun. It's just really effective gameplay loop. Moving over to the stat comparison, the stat we've actually ended up focusing on is weapons, and I've also ended up focusing on class a bit because we're gonna be able to spam those pretty quickly, and getting some free overshield every time we pop that class ability seemed useful, but this is very flexible. I think you can probably shift these around a little bit and get a little bit more into weapons versus class. Once again, Armor 3.0 stats are very flexible. You just have to kind of play around and see what works for you. So as mentioned, we're getting a pretty substantial boost to weapon damage. We're going to get 15% damage boost to all minors and majors. We're going to get a 46% chance of large ammo bricks. And then we'll get about 7% damage to bosses with primary or special weapons and about 4.6% with heavy weapons, which aren't huge, but they do add up when stacked with like weapon surges and other things like that. Our barricade cooldown and barricade regen is really huge. Our grenade regen is huge. Everything's generally working a lot better. The only thing that we are losing out on here is our melee. We are not focused into that at all, so don't expect to see it a whole lot. But the melee does not work very well with this build, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. Once again, overall really strong and kind of demonstrating what a weapon build might look like in this new Armor 3.0 meta. Now, that has been a lot of information. I thank you if you've hung in there with me. I just want to wrap up with some conclusions. There's some really solid buffs here. Generally, older or more medium melee builds are getting boosted hard, but the ones with like crazy damage stacking, which didn't have that much, are taking a nerf. Your stats are very important. Definitely focus on your stats. You can't just like slap on resilience, slap on discipline, call it good enough. You need to really think about these because they're going to affect your build. When used well, Armor 3.0 stats will enhance every single build. Every build here I think is going to be better than it is now, and that's cool. I've used 3 featured exotic builds here, but remember this only accounts for 3% DR. You don't really need to worry about it. It's just kind of nice to have a list of like, hey, here's some things you should maybe try out for this episode. And that's really the goal here. I don't think people should stress about it, but please don't yell at me in the comments for that, or do. I don't know. I'm not your boss. With all that said, thank you for watching. I also want to say thank you to my supporters, all my channel members, which are Louie, who is new, Equitas, Mirage, Sushi Juice, Maddie the Ace, Davey0011, Infernal Park 111, Radriel, and also a thanks to Spider Reviver, who checks all my math so that I look good. If you appreciate the work I do, you can join the channel to support even more cool guides and tools. Channel's had a lot of great growth lately. Just any support you can give me helps. Also, if you become a member, I will definitely consider any build you want to see. Lastly, I have a contest up on my channel. Check out the current post on my channel for that. It is a build contest and it ends this Friday, July 4th. So try and get an answer in there. I'm giving away some emblems, and for the best build of all, I will have a copy of the Year of Prophecy edition for that Bungie has gifted me. So definitely check that out. With all that said, thank you so much. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Let me know what you think in the comments. And with that, I'll let you go. Thanks.